We're just ready to get started. We're already a little bit past time, and we really don't want to cut into any of our time with these amazing panelists. I'm Jordan Mccray. I'm a first year's master's student here in geography at the University of Kentucky, and I'm one of the DOPE organizers.
And good evening, everyone. My name is Passama Cole-Qualey. I am a second year PhD student in the Department of Anthropology, and I am also a DOPE organizer with all of these other lovely individuals who are dispersed throughout the crowd. So we are super excited to welcome you all here this evening for our plenary panel. We have an awesome lineup of scholars, and we are so excited to be able to engage with them. So we want this to be a very safe and interactive space where the scholars are able to share some of their praxis, their methods, their ethics, and how they engage with different bodies of literature and different forms of research in ways that are reflective of who they are as both scholars, as well as in their civic engagement. So we're super excited to get it going. We have an awesome moderator, and then after they kind of present their work, they'll answer some questions, and then we will open it all up to you all to be very participatory in this process. So we look forward to welcoming you into this conversation.
Okay, great. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Liberato. Dr. Anna S.Q. Liberato was born and raised in the Dominican Republic. She has a BS in statistics from the Autonomous University of Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. She completed her doctoral degree in sociology from the University of Florida in 2005. Dr. Liberato's research interests include inequalities based on race, ethnicity, gender, class, and their interplay with migration, mobility, political identity, and political attitudes. Dr. Liberato also has a special interest in memory studies, as well as the political, cultural, and socioeconomic processes taking place in the Caribbean and Latin American societies because of economic globalization and the democratization processes that followed authoritarian regimes. So I'm just going to pass it off to her, and we can start the panel. Thank you.
How about now? Yes, you can hear me. Maybe too much now. Thank you, Jordan, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Passama. And just as a reminder, I will tell you what we'll be doing in the next hour and a half. So I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists briefly, and then we will have speaker presentations, about 10 minutes, right, per panelist. And then I will, after that is completed, we will move to the general discussion questions that I have to spark discussion and conversations. And our panelists will engage those questions in any way they like. And then at the end, we will arrive to general conclusions. We want to go home with thoughts to think about. I think I didn't tell this to Jordan or Passama, but this is like the hope. We are at the DOPE conference, but this is like the hope plenary session because I try to make my two questions to focus more on agency, resistance, social change. So they are an important ingredient of the conversation. So we go home with, as I said, with specific thoughts that could be translated into action and motivation to keep going, working on these important issues that drive us to be here on a Friday afternoon. And thank you for being here from Colombia, New York, and from not too far away from Nashville. Well, we decided that I was going to introduce the panelists by going by their last name in alphabetical order. So I know you want to be a gentleman, but I will go with the plan of going by alphabetical order. Okay? So let me start by introducing Dr. Justin Dunnavant. Dr. Dunnavant is an academic pathways postdoctoral fellow at Vanderbilt University's Spatial Analysis Research Laboratory. His current work in the U.S. Virgin Islands investigates the relationship between ecology and enslavement in the former Danish West Indies. He has conducted archaeological research in U.S. Virgin Islands, Belize, Jamaica, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Gambia. As a regular participant in Diving with a Purpose maritime archaeology training program, Dr. Dunnavant is developing his skills in maritime archaeology. I really want to take a course on maritime archaeology. Working with this organization, he has assisted with the documentation of the Slobodna and Acorn wrecks, as well as the search for the slave ship Guerrero. Dr. Dunnavant is co-founder and president of the Society of Black Archaeologists and AAUS Scientific Scuba Diver, and consults also for the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture Slave Wrecks Project. Thank you again for being here. And then that was T, so I will continue with G. And we are pleased to have Dr. Macarena Gomez-Barris here today. She's a professor at the Pratt Institute. Dr. Gomez-Barris is also chairperson of Social Science and Cultural Studies at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. She's also director of the Global South Center, a research center that works at the intersection of social ecologies, art, politics, and decolonial methodologies. Dr. Gomez-Barris is author of Where Memory Dwells, Culture and State Violence in Chile. I use your book for my first book on memory in the Dominican Republic. And this is co-editor with Hernan Gray co-editor with Hernan Gray, or Hernan Gray of Towards the Sociology of Trace, published in 2010. She also published The Extractive Zone, Social Ecologies and Decolonial Perspectives, published in 2017. And in 2018, she published the book Beyond the Pink Tide, Art and Politics in the Americas. And last, certainly not least, Diana, we have Dr. Diana Ojeda. Dr. Ojeda is associate professor at Instituto Pensar en la Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogotá, Colombia, and she came all the way from Bogotá to join us here today. She's a feminist geographer whose work bridges political ecology and feminist geopolitics. Based on her research experience in the Colombian Caribbean, Dr. Ojeda has contributed to the study of issues such as land grabbing, dispossession, and the politics of conservation. Her current research explores the relationship between gender and agrarian activism in Colombia. Extractivism in Colombia. Thank you. Her recent publications address neo-Malthusianism in climate change discourse and policy. And then I will yield the floor to the speakers so they can do their own short presentations.
Okay. Great, thank you. Wonderful. So, good afternoon, buenas tardes. It's, yeah. All right, great. What an incredible room. So it's really exciting to be here. I just got off a plane. I was stuck in DC for some of the afternoon, so thank you to the organizers for the beautiful invitation to be here. You know, this panel, I'm excited to engage you. I thought I'd start off by just giving a little bit of a context for the work that I do, and then we can talk more informally in Q&A. And I should be about 11 or 12 minutes, but stop me if, you know, I go on too much. For me, I came to political ecology late. I think I've been doing political ecology maybe most of my career, and then find that the kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary vision and some of the political questions and acumen actually is very you know, important and resonates with our time. So I want to start by saying that we need this kind of scholarship now. So let me begin with an anecdote. At an Earthly Matters conference last year, the keynote address was given by the novelist and critic Amitav Ghosh, whose work some of you may have read. And in chart after chart, Ghosh really showed us the immense military and capitalist carbon footprint. And for me, it was refreshing to see this as kind of challenge to the mainstream wisdom about the true culprit and instigator of global climate change. In naming military capitalism, Ghosh produced a quantitative narrative and frighteningly too real thick description of our world's careening towards ultimate apocalypse. In the packed room of maybe 300 people, just slightly more than in here, right? I got up the nerve to ask not the obvious question, which was how literature and cultural production could turn the tide of the era he calls the Great Derangement, but instead asked what other modes already exist, and that what modes can address spaces of ruinous capitalism to raise the possibility of decolonial futures. Listening carefully to my question, he paused for a few seconds longer than was comfortable for me and said something like this, quote, "I'm afraid it's too late. We are barreling forward already to that future," end quote. With this statement, Ghosh seemed to conclude that there was little to be done, noting the inevitability of the anthropogenic-led collapse of the planet and its ecologies. Since that moment, I've been trying to reckon with the existential fallout of no future, a heady thought trail that returned me not only to Lee Edelman's work that some of you might be familiar with, that kind of work on queer no futures, but and that extends Freud's work on the death drive, but also to a kind of universalist existential nihilism that I would suggest disappears indigenous and Black ontologies, its resistance and refusal. And for me, the perspective of a kind of indigenous or hemispheric view, a global Southern perspective, actually works against these kinds of totalizing views, which have their own extractive epistemology, I would argue. This indeed motivated some of my research questions in the extractive zone. In that book, I asked, what are the forms of representation and knowledge production that can lead us out of the trap of the universalizing account of the Anthropocene? And for me, the way I kind of situated that work was to find answers to that question through indigenous critique and movements, through environmental testimonials, I think a genre we all could think about more, through transversal activisms, through anarcho-feminisms, through decolonial queer methods, minor viewpoints, and writing against the binary of the human and non-human, or what Mel Chen and Dana Luciano refer to as the inhuman. And this is all to offer old and new strategies for staging how the politics of ruined territories can be envisioned through and beyond what I'm calling the extractive zone. So one response to some of these ideas has suggested that we actually put too much pressure on indigenous critical theory. And that's a question I would put to all of you, to all of us, right? And also the question of indigenous survivability and resurgence to sustain an imaginary of the future. To me, however, this position seems a bit dangerous amidst an increasingly polarizing academic and public discourse, especially as the operations of primitive accumulation continue to unabatedly extract from native lands and Afro-Indigenous territories and from racialized bodies and histories and archaeologies, right? So as a non-native scholar and as a child of empire originally from Chile, I'm actually not interested in rehearsing the binaries that reproduce the settler condition. And we can talk about settler colonialism and what it means to kind of inscribe ourselves in those positions. I turn to the work of someone like Jody Bird and also to the work of Jean O'Brien, who actually remind us, right, that the very structures of a sole focus on colonial conditions can actually further marginalize indigenous voices. Yet we need to describe coloniality. Coloniality is central to this discussion. And I think, you know, again, pointing to political ecology, it's done this since the 1980s. And it's a multidisciplinary field that I feel is I'm in conversation with it to a certain degree. My own work has really been to muddy the waters of naming developmentalism and the logics of the extractive view, and at the same time making room for local actors and artistic praxis. And this is artists not only as those who we extract from as scholars, but those we work in tandem with and produce theory with, theory makers as well, right? And this has actually led me also to Kehaulani Kauanui's notion, the Kanaka Maoli scholar, of indigenous endurance. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit today in a couple of examples how this works out, this idea of both disappearing certain kinds of indigenous ontologies and perspectives, and on the other hand, thinking about the question of survivance, endurance, and submerged perspectives. So for me, these are kind of alternative forms of organizing social life, right, that we can turn to from within the extractive zone. And what does it mean to actually live and learn from that other side of catastrophe? So not that idea, right, that Amitav Ghosh had in that moment of the kind of catastrophes forthcoming, but it's currently ongoing. So the work of mestiza multimedia Colombian artist Carolina Caicedo, and this is an artist I've worked with extensively on in the Magdalena Cauca Valley in the southwestern region of Colombia. She's recently returned her video work and installation art to take stock of the disaster caused by the Itapu Dam in Brazil. This was constructed in 1973. It took a decade to build, but there were hundreds of floodings along Guarani and Mestizax territories over the last 45 years. In the film, A Gente Rio, Caicedo's eye showed us the muddied racial geographies of colonial extraction and uncovers painful collective testimonials of indigenous dispossession, and she uses long pans and mid-level shots to visualize this flood trail. In a carefully crafted sequence that foregrounds the experience of disorientation by local communities, a fisherman narrates how the Paraná River is now completely out of control, rising unnaturally 8 or 9 meters one day, then dipping below 2 feet of water the next. And as the fisherman says, quote, "The river moves too quickly and the fish loses his connection," end quote. Narrating the fish's disorientation during the early moment in the film actually destabilizes an anthropocentric viewpoint and indicates the coming disaster or the literal flooding without warning. As one displaced female resident tells it, the impending catastrophe was not foretold, as if to foretell the dystopic worlds of Garcia Marquez. Quote, "It came at 4 a.m., end quote, she says. Quote, "The dam brought with it entire houses, cars, uprooted trees, mountainsides, animals, and people, with no warning by state officials of the immediate violence to come," end quote. After a series of such testimonials, we return to the voice of the fisherman, who reminds the viewer that, quote, "Before the dam, the river stayed stable," end quote. So what Caicedo's camera is doing here is tracking between this disorienting movement of the river and the afterlives of the dam's destruction, where water lines rise and fall. And with her, we're able to see how the damming logic becomes the technocratic manager of surrounding life and death. As the fisherman puts it, quote, "Itapu," right, the dam, "does whatever it wants with the river," end quote. And here we can make a similar analogy about how colonialism or coloniality of power, buries the histories of indigenous survival. It does whatever it wants with these territories. And so in A Gente Rio, Caicedo gives us this unequivocal message, damning, be damned, right? La represa in Spanish is to repress. So she's interlocking the kind of extractive capitalism with authoritarianism. The Itapu Dam flooded more than 165 acres of Guarani territories. It displaced at least 38 indigenous communities. And really in a move here of amnesic settler erasure that can be tracked throughout the Americas, the Itapu Corporation and the Brazilian state funded the Museum of the Guarani. You might know such museums, right? Where the state steps in, the corporate state steps in, and actually produces a kind of celebration of the native, even as it's dispossessing them. So here there are wildlife trails, etc., and also a kind of harking back to the dispossession that was caused during both Portuguese and Spanish resettlements. So what I'm pointing here is to the overlapping spaces here of ongoing dispossession. And I'll just end by showing you the work very quickly of another example of the dialectic of kind of memory and indigenous disappearance in the work of Cecilia Vicuña's work in her 2012 documentary, and this is in the northern Pacific region of Chile. And what this kind of submerged perspective is here is to actually retrain us to the epistemological vision of what it means to reduce life to systems or commodities in a space where there's enormous marine extraction, right? And she herself orients to the sea and describes the kind of ways in which she senses the sea or becomes a sea and plays with the sea in a kind of edge play. So this is what I'm interested in thinking about as part of my methodology. She does this decolonial, queer, femme orientation, and by that I mean she's opening herself to the porous environment and allowing and taking in certain kinds of sensibilities in these spaces that scramble the kind of normativity between her own body and the interactivity between the Pacific Ocean, and moving away from the thingification of the sea. And is this a methodology we might want to play with and might want to think about a little bit? And then just to end, to say that part of this work is really to show the kind of ongoing violence and the embodiment in the sea in relationship, but also to show us not only the kind of red tide disasters or algae blooms that are taking place, but also how the name and use of indigenous peoples is central to the oil refinery in the area. And later, she also shows us that it is upon indigenous sacred burial grounds, right, that the oil refinery has not only taken the name, but installed its kind of itself over it. So all that to suggest that I think we have to think with artists in powerful ways, name and figure out new languages in part of our conceptual work, and think beyond our disciplinary epistemes to describe these these ongoing worlds, these apocalypse in motion, and maybe then we'll have a chance to actually work against the derangement that Ghosh pronounced where it was the end of these worlds. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Thank you to the dope organizers, to some dope panelists, to a dope audience. This is an amazing conference. I wish we would have had this for archaeology, but I can tell you now we are nowhere close to having this yet. So I feel honored to be in this space. Again, my name is Dr. Justin Dunnavant. I'd like to give thanks for everybody for coming here. Give thanks to the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Shawnee, indigenous peoples who occupy these lands that we now reside on today. And I give thanks to all of our relations. And I want to jump into it from an archaeological perspective, which is very different from geography in some ways, but really has a lot to draw from when we think theoretically about the material culture that we work with. So I'm going to ask that you please bless me with that one finger when my 1 minute time is up. And I'm going to try to keep a little timer right here so I can also have an idea. Okay, cool. All right, so the focus of my research is really on this conversation of ecology and slavery and looking at the ecological impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. This is something that archaeologists have been doing very recently over the last 5 years or so, and we happen to have a conference at Santa Cruz, I believe it was in 2018 that we did this, that really discussed this idea and this topic of what were these ecological impacts over a long period of time. I'm trying to address this specifically from research that we're doing in St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands, also known as II by the indigenous name. One of the unique things about the island is that, one, it was owned by the Danish, so it provides us with a different aspect of understanding colonialism in the Caribbean. But then also this project was started in a very unique and different way. And one of the things we're trying to do is change the actual practice of archaeology itself. So addressing theoretical questions, but also changing the practice. This project was developed with seed funding from the Slave Wrecks Project, which is a collaboration between the Smithsonian and GW, searching for slave shipwrecks all over the world. And we built a number of collaborations, mainly with our partners Diving with a Purpose and Junior Scientists in the Sea, explicitly to train youth in the Virgin Islands in scuba diving and archaeology. From that, our research questions developed afterwards. So it's sort of a different model. Our training really addressed youth from the Boys and Girls Club on the Virgin Islands. So every year we go down there over the summer. We take students from the Boys and Girls Club. Our colleagues with Junior Scientists in the Sea certify them in scuba diving, and then we take them on in a one-week intensive workshop training and teach them the basics of archaeology, how to identify basic artifacts, how to excavate, and then how to do basic identification and analysis. This is all done by our colleague, Dr. Alex Jones, who runs a program called Archaeology in the Community. Since the initial project, we decided to turn it into a larger pipeline. So in 2018, we had our first group of HBCU students come out, so we addressed it at the college level. We had 4 students from historically black colleges come out from Howard, Spelman, and Morgan, and this summer we'll be bringing in 4 more students. I see we got some alum in the room, beautiful. And the idea is that we're really trying to expose students to archaeology. I was one of the last graduates of Howard University's anthropology program before they shut it down, and there are very few historically black colleges and universities today that have the program, which means that if they want to go on to pursue archaeology and PhD programs, they're not competitive because they don't have that opportunity. So that's what we're trying to do here, and we have funding from the University of California's UC HBCU program to do that. Now, the general theoretical guideline and framework, what we're trying to do is really do what Toni Morrison argued, is resituating the sense of black space and this black presence when we look at geography, but also when we look at history. And so these are just some of the people that lived on that land at the estate Little Princess in II. We focused our attention and our excavations on the enslaved cabin village and the community where people lived and worked. You can see from this image that the buildings were reworked and lived in actually until the 1960s when the government came in and actually took the roofs off of these buildings. One of the most interesting finds that we come across is bedrock modification. And so we find post holes that are drilled into the bedrock. Initially, we thought these were used for either additions onto houses or maybe in between structures, but now we believe that it may have actually been built on top of a pre-existing Taino community, which is very significant. When we think about sort of genocide and displacement of indigenous peoples, we rarely think of it as an intentional move. But I think we really need to reposition this idea of thinking that these Caribbean islands weren't just, it wasn't just a haphazard genocide. It was very intentional in terms of where communities would then be located, where plantations would be located, and oftentimes these indigenous communities picked ripe locations. So again, we're trying to resituate and recenter this black sense of space, in some ways trying to flip these sort of protagonists in the image and focus on those who don't really get talked about as much. So how do we do this? One way is theoretically shifting the lens. So what I'm trying to develop now is a black historical ecology. And we're trying to recenter this, again, this idea of what is it unique about the black experience that requires historical ecology in that framework. One of them is understanding that violences to the land are directly tied to violences to the body. So II was completely carved up into plantations, every square acre of it. They actually had to create their own unit of measure because it was a Danish colonial government with a number of British colonial plantation owners on the island. And then these lands were then commodified just as bodies were commodified and labor was commodified. There's this understanding that terrestrial and maritime sites are combined. Tiffany King calls it the Black Shoals, sort of muddying this idea of separation between the two. So I'm actively exploring coral mining on the island. A lot of these structures were built with coral that came from the sea outside of it. And I can talk more about the specifics of the research in the Q&A. And then understanding that natural sites are also cultural sites, and they're imbued with meaning making and history. And so what we've done is we're working on actually building out a larger oral history mapping project where we look at baobab trees, tamarind trees, and kapok, or silk cotton trees on the island. Tamarind trees have historically been known to mark enslaved cemeteries throughout the Virgin Islands. And so there's a number of different ways that we can begin to map black people back onto these landscapes by looking at the natural environment. And there's also then a need to interrogate this idea of the plantation logic, again coming out of black geographies, and plantation futures, and the ways in which they permeate into the present. And one of this is looking more explicitly at rum production today. We see that from the top, the Crucian Rum Factory still is produced on the island today. Captain Morgan just fairly recently moved onto the island as a production hub as well. And from the bottom, we see scientists have done a sea change analysis that demonstrates that algae blooms coming off the southern coast of the island are actively coming from runoff from the Crucian Rum Factory. And the southern part of this island is known for having some of the least biodiversity and some of the lowest taxodiversity of coral and fish. Which then leads us again to this larger theoretical question, a theoretical concern. If the Anthropocene proclaims to be a sudden concern with the exposures of environmental harm to white liberal communities, it does so in the wake of histories in which these harms have been knowingly exploited to black and brown communities under the rubric of cultivation, progress, modernization, and capitalism. So again, recentering that these ideas are not anything new, this idea of a continual destruction in the wake of capitalism. And then one of the things we try to do as well is not just to identify these problems, but then offer some form of restitution or redress as well. We know that we didn't necessarily create these issues, or in some cases where communities were coerced into doing so, we still feel as though we have a responsibility to offer some form of redress. And so what we do, in addition to the archaeology, a number of us are scuba divers as well. We work with Diving with a Purpose, and we help to clean coral trees, outplant coral into the community, into these nurseries. And then the idea is that we can offer some form of restitution to some of the environmental issues that are going forward. It gives us all a sort of better understanding of how these natural and cultural environments progress. And as a result of that, we also take the HBCU students and give them an opportunity to learn how to scuba dive as well. Some of them didn't know how to swim when they first came to us and tried to jump in the water and teach themselves. So we figured we should formalize the process so we don't have a whole nother issue on our hands. To date, we have certified 18 young people from II, from St. Croix, in scuba diving, and that's through our colleague junior scientists in the sea. 2 students have become employed in local dive shops. 10 HBCU students have been trained through our program already, and there are 2 graduate students pursuing doctoral work on the island. And this is all from last year. We're going again this summer as well, and we'll continue on with funding a summer after that. And then very briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, I've got about 2 minutes. Okay, I'm good on time. All right, I'll talk a little bit slower now. Expanding the framework. I presented some of this work earlier last year for those of you who were able to attend here at the University of Kentucky. And now that I'm at Vanderbilt, I'm expanding this framework to focus more specifically on a historical ecology of marronage. And I'm specifically looking at the ways in which maroons are left off of the landscapes through cartographical sort of techniques and tricks. So what we see here is an early Danish colonial map. And at the top there, it has named all the quarters. And at the top it says sort of uncharted land. And the interesting thing about that uncharted land is that uncharted land was actually known by many people in the community as the site of Maroon Ridge, where maroon communities lived. So it was only uncharted because they couldn't access it because maroons were actively living there. So the idea, again, is to resituate them back on this landscape. And one way I'm trying to do that now is through the Spatial Analysis Lab is through mapping ocean current data to better understand where these maroon communities existed and where they would have naturally gone as they were maritime maroons headed throughout the Caribbean. And so many people left St. Croix and ended up in Puerto Rico. So in the spring months, the ocean currents take you south of the island. But in the fall months, the ocean currents take you north of the island. And anybody here from Puerto Rico or been to Puerto Rico? All right, there's a few hands. So you all will know that one of the largest concentrations of Afro-Puerto Ricans, or Boricenians, is just outside of San Juan and Luisa. And Luisa is known to have a strong maroon community. Many people in that community still identify with their maroon heritage. The British actually tried to come in and take the island at one point in the 18th century, and the first people they encountered were the maroons that existed here. It was an interesting relationship because the Spanish colonial government actually encouraged maroons to come to the island because a lot of them helped build the forts that were in and around San Juan. And in exchange for 1 year of labor, they were given their freedom and granted their land. One of the things I'm trying to do is resituate the political importance of maroons as well, because it got so serious that the Danish government actually contacted the Spanish government, and they had to work out a separate treaty just so that they wouldn't continue to take maroons from these islands. It also has larger political implications and ecological implications because the Privy Council in St. Thomas demanded that all trees large enough to build canoes be cut down because so many maroons were making their own canoes and escaping to these other islands. So there's a larger sort of political ecological history that we have yet to explore. And I will stop there on time. Thank you.
Okay, So, hi, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I want to also thank our organizing committee for, this amazing work. And I'm thrilled to be part of this panel and to join you all for what I'm sure will be a very exciting conversation. Peruvian scholar Rocío Silva Santiesteban refers to extractivism as a biopolitical project. She argues, very much in line with Argentinian scholar Maristela Svampa, that extractivism has become hegemonic. She thus states the need to build a post-extractivist thought. Where do we find space of maneuver amidst the expansion and intensification of extractivism? How do we crack it open when its logics are so tightly entangled with violence? How do we open up room for a different political and environmental imagination? To answer this set of questions, I will first turn my attention to extractivism's definition, so be patient, please, with me. Coming from a long tradition of decolonial dependency and ecofeminist studies in Latin America, extractivism gained attention in the late 90s with the expansion of mining, hydrocarbons, and soy plantations in countries such as Peru and Argentina. As we saw the effects of the late 2000s crisis, questions around extractivism became central to social movements, activist, and academic circles in Latin America. Studies generally point to the capture of value from nature. In that sense, one of extractivism's key characteristics has been the control of huge amounts of natural resources, often aimed at an external market. They have also insisted on its devastating social and environmental effects. I argue that a key articulating element and one often overlooked is gender. Ángela Erpel Jara, Amalia Leguizamón, and Astrid Ulloa, among other Latin American feminists, have pointed to how extractivism's effects over land tenure, health, and the environment are disproportionately distributed along gender lines. To be sure, violence, particularly against women and other feminized subjects, becomes routinized in extractive sites, both in the form of direct violence and of the exacerbation of structural inequalities. But despite gender centrality to the configuration of the social and thus environmental order, fewer works have analyzed its role in setting up the conditions that allow for the implementation, maintenance, and expansion of extractivist projects. This with the clear exception of indigenous and communitarian feminists, such as Lorena Capnal, Julieta Paredes, and Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who have insisted on the perverse marriage of extractivism and patriarchy, and who also speak a lot about this connection between body and territory and how one violence fits into the other, as you mentioned. So thinking with them, I want to turn my attention to the gendered workings of extractivism. To do so, I think we need to insist on the inseparability of production and social reproduction. And this point of departure, of course, relates with Nancy Fraser's take on Marx's hidden abode of production. In her analysis, this move to an examination of the conditions of exploitation reveals a dirty secret. Capital expands via the non-compensation of a portion of workers' labor time. But calling for a more comprehensive conception of capitalism, Fraser emphasizes on Marx's second move at the end of Capital Volume 1, through which an even dirtier secret is unveiled. Quote, behind the sublimated coercion of wage labor lies overt violence and outright theft, end quote. This move from exploitation to expropriation requires an analysis of dispossession that puts extra economic conditions at the center. I hope to do this using 3 examples. So the first example, fear in the plot. Montes de Maria is a region in the north of Colombia, about an hour away from Cartagena. Its history and geography have been marked by conflict between landowners and peasants. More recently, Montes de Maria is best known for the unprecedented violence carried out by paramilitaries at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. To give you an idea, in less than a decade, there were 56 massacres, 215,000 cases of forced displacement, and 82,000 hectares of stolen lands. The taken lands were quickly incorporated into the market, giving way to oil palm plantations through a dual strategy of violent and legalized dispossession. Since then, death threats, curtailed mobility, and restricted access to resources became the day-to-day experience for Montes de Maria's peasants, Black, and indigenous communities. In this context, sustained attacks to social reproduction and different forms of gender-based violence have been fundamental for opening up new spaces for agrarian extractivism as well as for maintaining them. For example, the use of sexual violence and other forms of war against women's bodies helped the spreading terror and displacing entire towns. But as many of the sexual attacks have occurred when women are working on their plots, This has been a very powerful message in terms of what Argentinian scholar Rita Segato calls a pedagogy of cruelty. Sexual harassment and assault, as well as the strict control over women's itineraries and sexuality, have worked as a very effective mechanism of disciplining women and limiting them to domestic spaces. They resent not working the land and cherish the possibility their gardens give them to deal with illness, death, and trauma. Moreover, the reclusion to the home hasn't reduced their workday. On the contrary, now that they can't grow food, and with the intensified monetization of the economy, they had to become food vendors and domestic workers in other towns and peri-urban centers. For them, getting food has implied accessing money, as well as a greater dependency on male partners and relatives. My second example is from the palm we can't eat. With rice, it was very different. We could eat. The palm is different, you see? We can't eat from the palm, told me Marjorie's one day of July 2014. In her account, the dirtier secret of capitalist accumulation is laid bare. The front story of exploitation is part of it, but only one. Instead, it is the backstory of expropriation what helps us better understand agrarian extractivism. Marjorie's usually refers to the times before oil palm with nostalgia. It's not that she idealizes men's working conditions with the rice plantations brought to the region in the 1960s, not that she has forgotten the suffocating sensation of the pesticides that the fumigation plane left behind. Her place within the plantation has not changed much as well, providing the reproductive work and coming afterwards to pick up the leftovers from the harvest. What is radically different is explicit in her brutal assertion: before we could eat. Within the oil palm economy, it is men who get hired. Women are left to be peperas, or fruit pickers. They go in groups, walking behind the men and picking up the fruit that falls from the bunches they are collecting and transporting. Peperas are directly paid by male workers according to the weight of the fruit picked. They make no more than $2 a day, when they don't do it as a favor for their loved ones. In some cases, women are even forced to work as peperas, so their partners know they know where they are and with whom. And my third example is the glass of water. One day in July 2014, I was sitting outside of Lucia's home, a corrugated metal roof rack surrounded by oil palm. Her home, like many other peasant homes in Montes de Maria, have been taken over by palm, mostly drowning in the middle of such a vast and dense green desert. The strong leaves of the palm oil, constantly scratched Lucia's corrugated metal roof while we were talking. The sound always reminded me of nails scratching a blackboard. You know we had to change the thatched roof for the metal one, right? She tells me, referring to how paramilitaries burned her former house and displaced her and her 3 girls. The oil palm scratching her roof is not only a constant reminder of the paramilitary violence and of the enclosure and entrapment that the plantations have produced, it is also the main reason why peasants do not have water. Water grabbing in Montes de Maria has occurred as part of the deliberate production of water scarcity by oil palm, teak, and other plantations. Not only water has been deliberately enclosed and diverted, it has also been poisoned. The endless rows of green oil palm are testimony of the toxic legacies that landscapes and bodies will carry for generations. It was almost noon and the heat became unbearable. We saw a young man, a worker at the plantation, coming out looking desperate, thirsty, clearly dehydrated. The children ran and gave him a glass of water, wasting no time, but also as if it was just normal. He drank it immediately, a glass of the same water so scarce and so hardly won by the daily work of women and children. The glass of water subsidizes the plantation at the same time that brings care into it. It enables, as well as disputes, a violent socio-environmental regime based on situated and embodied terror, dispossession, and toxicity. Even if it is true for capitalism in general, I think the blatant deterioration of local living conditions is one of extractivism's mark. The shift from production to reproduction results central for its functioning. And as I have shown, gender is not subsidiary, but constitutive of it. This approach, I would say, can contribute to making visible the everyday, ordinary geographies through which an extractivist socio-environmental regime is contested. It is through the dispossession of feminized bodies, spaces, social ties, and reproductive labor that palm oil plantations are implemented and sustained. At the same time, it is through them that extractivism is contained and subverted. Perhaps the gardens, the food, and the glasses of water house already what a post-extractivist thought is all about. Thank you.
All right, can we give another applause to our incredible panelists? Thank you so much for that. Thank you. Thank you. Wow, you know, I've been taking notes, and I'm just looking at some of the themes that emerge from your presentations. I have the colonial futures, the colonial methodologies, the dynamics of disappearing, surviving, and endurance. And we also heard about where the pursuit of a historical ecology has taken you and others in your research in the Caribbean, resituating black spaces in a historized way, right? And then we have a very particular and powerful story about the gender dynamics of extraction. You know, when I introduced the panel, I told you that this was going to be the Hope panel, because we knew that our panelists have been, you know, working in very interesting places, interacting with very interesting people, and also becoming very familiar and knowledgeable about certain problems involving the populations with whom they've been interacting, you know, in their research and also their engagement. So the hope part here comes from our interest in talking today about solutions, change, and lessons that we could be learned. So all these journeys that you've undertaken with your scholarship and your engagement as citizens, and I have a question. And I had two questions, but I think I will limit myself to one and then open to a Q&A since time is passing. But my question to the panelists is, which you think are the most effective and inspiring forms of resistance that you have encountered in your work with the communities that you have mentioned here today? And also, what lessons can we draw from their agency? What can we learn from their resistance? Yes?
Yeah, I mean, big questions. Let's see. I think the question of resistance and can be one that we could talk about for many hours, and it's important. And when I think about it, I often think about resistance refusal. I think about it as often a kind of sliver-edge space of possibility, potentialities within very overdetermined contexts of violence and colonial memory, and in all the ways we heard today, extractivism. And I think about the possibilities of collectivities working in tandem in the spaces that I work in with the earth, with land, with memory, with water in very powerful ways. And I think about anti-extractive activisms. It's a mouthful, but the kind of potential of going against the kind of colonial, impetus. And I think especially in some of these places, the way in which peoples themselves describe not just a kind of artisanal relationship with land or vernacular, local or historical relationship with land and water and seas and et cetera, rivers, but actually absolutely entangled and imbricated with it. And so for me, I'm kind of thinking, resistance is powerful. It has a historical arc. We can think of different kinds of categories of resistance subjects, the fugitives, Marinage, indigenous peoples writ large, Afro-Indigenous peoples, the land, body, et cetera. But I'm also interested in beyond the colonial divide. So not only that sliver-age space of resistance, but that space where social life produces itself otherwise, and how we can leverage, and you gave us that powerful, beautiful image of the kind of re-texturizing of the coral. That kind of, you can't separate the human and the non-human there, right? In this kind of powerful submerged space. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's how, and you can hear there how I'm languaging specific things, right? Because I also think it's quite poetic how this happens. It's not just an easy thing to describe. So, sorry if I went on. Okay.
I guess for me, one of the most effective tools I've seen is targeting youth. No matter what community you go into, if you talk about empowering youth, you automatically get everybody's attention. And I mean everybody, regardless of where they lean politically, regardless of how they feel about a certain entity. And so that was our initial entry point. We were just surprised by all the doors that opened up as soon as we started talking about empowering the youth to do work. So I would stress that in any project you do. So now all projects we do, we always have a training component and a media component, because we said we're not going to wait for somebody else to tell a story about how we did this. And we're also going to make sure that we don't need to be here in the future, because there's people that can take this on. Without getting too deep, I used to stress resist, but now I stress restore. So I live by a mantra of remember, remind, restore. I think restoring for me is important in recentering the conversation, because there are many barriers to restoration, and they don't always need to be resisted. Oftentimes we can go around them. Oftentimes we can work sort of outside of their sphere and their purview. And if we spend our entire lives resisting, we're going to be just focusing on a specific problem and not a potential future. And so I think going towards that future requires this idea of restoration as opposed to resistance.
Can I borrow yours?
Yes, of course.
Or yours?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll get yours. Thank you. I think that is a difficult but a much needed question, because among many things, I refuse to repeat catastrophic narratives which fuel, exploitation and racism and misogyny and militarization. And I think I don't know, these times bring up a lot of catastrophic narratives, and I refuse to repeat them. And it made me think of two things. One is that I've always been super pessimistic, and I remember having, these conversations about, when I entered grad school, 2005, with Diane Rochelieu, having these conversations of why I was so pessimistic. And I remained like that. Like, I was super stubborn and pessimistic, and that was me and my identity, and, leave me alone, always dressed in black, that's me. Until after doing several years of field work in Montes de Maria, one day I met with Abel. Abel is a peasant who we've been working together for a while, and his son just died from an accident. The only son that was left alive by these paramilitary forces, and he dies in an accident. And I was like, Abel, I'm so sorry. This is horrible, and I'm just so pessimistic. This is, like the worst thing that can happen, and I don't know what else can go wrong because, And he said, oh, no, well, I know you're pessimistic. The thing is, I don't have the luxury to be pessimistic. So pessimism is a privilege that you have. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. So that was, like one thing, like the rest of the world has to make it work. So I decided, that we should all make it work. And the other thing that made me think of is Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui in this long, beautiful interview that they do, that this woman, Claudia, does. Well, it's a long, beautiful interview where she gets to tell her own story, and she's reflecting on all these different things. And they ask her, where do you see revolution? Is revolution happening in the kind of things that you do? And Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui says, revolution has, the colonial time. It's like, what is all the hurry? This is gonna take time, this is gonna take work, and it is slow. It's not like you're gonna see it from one day to the other. So I thought of those two things to answer your question.
Thank you. So I think it's time to open it up to our very wonderful audience. So we have, how many minutes? We have about 30 minutes to address your questions. Yeah,
yes.
great time. So,
Beautiful.
who has questions for the audience? I'm sorry, for the panelists. Any questions?
You can
So
borrow
if you
ours.
raise your hands, we go with the
Test,
microphone.
test. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
It's over there.
Hi, whoa, that is louder than I thought I was going to be. I have a question for Dr. Dunnavant. Because we are in Kentucky, the land of bourbon, and because you mentioned rum, I thought I would ask, I know that rum production varies so much in space and in time, and the rum distillery that you mentioned seems like it has a clearly negative effect on the ecology of the island. Have you encountered either in archaeology and history or contemporaneously examples of rum production which can be used kind of as an emancipatory project or recentering black communities in historical narratives and in spaces today?
That's a great question. I had a conversation with Tony Bowes at Brown earlier this year, and we were talking about this very question because he talks about he doesn't drink rum anymore, and he's from Jamaica, so that's a big deal if a Jamaican doesn't drink rum. But we talked about how rum can be altered to be healing, and we talked about how it's used in libations, how some people add milk to it, how there's different ceremonies that serve purposes that make it healing in a certain way. And I think that there are definitely ways that we can begin to, and our people historically have taken things that have traditionally been negative and make them positive or make them be used in positive ways. So that's the way I see it there. There is cases of rum production that are on smaller scales. From a very practical component, Crucian is actually developing ways that involve less runoff. So there are people that are trying to address it from that larger scale. But more metaphysically, I think there are ways that it can be altered to be healing, a site of healing.
Hello. Oh my gosh. I have a question to Dr. Diana Ojeda. Gracias por su presentación. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to hear about a little bit more the methodologies that you use in your field work. And also, I was wondering if you have any approach to local and national government, especially municipalities, and especially if you did you find any female leader, campesinas leader in that area? And how was your experience working with them?
I'll use your mic again. Thank you. Thanks for your question. I do a lot of ethnographic and collaborative work. I've been working with the same group of organizations for the last 7 years or so, intermittently. It's not like I just move there. I come and go as much as I can and try to use the funding that I get to adjust to their needs and to their demands. Actually, this position came to me as a demand. They said, okay, you can do research with us, but we want to think about this possession and tell us about this possession. So I was like, okay, I don't know, but there's maybe a book from this geographer that maybe I can check. So I started digging into that. One concrete example is this school that we did. It was an itinerant school for water defense in Montes de Maria, all with women peasant leaders. That's mostly the people I work with female campesinas. And in that school, what we did was visiting each other to learn about different strategies of water defense and strategies against water grabbing in different areas of the region of Montes de Maria. I don't work with local government. I usually don't even interview them. And palm oil entrepreneurs, I don't even interview them as well for two reasons. Not that we shouldn't be doing that kind of work and doing ethnography, but I feel like their voices are so official and so loud, and you find them all over the place in Colombia that I really don't want to listen to them again in a way. But also in terms of just safety my own and with the people I work with. So that's kind of a methodological decision I also took. But yes, mostly working with women and taking care of children and cooking and cutting onions. I guess that's the kind of field work that I do. And with some friends, we even had to write a paper that is called the Princess Anthropologist because, sometimes the kind of work that we do is not taken seriously in the discipline of, I'm not an anthropologist even, so calling myself a princess anthropologist is doubly, it's like double insult. But it's usually, yes, yeah, and that's another different conversation, but methods is a very important question, thank you.
Any other question?
Yes, we have one right here.
Great.
No. So thank you all. Your research is fascinating to me. Coming from Latin America, this is like everything I want to see. So my question is for Dr. Gomez-Barris. So you mentioned that not directly your work, but you are engaging with work with the Itaipulam and that kind of testimonials on the Brazilian side of the construction and the consequences of the dam of, but that's a binational, is that a word? Yeah, binational hydroelectric plant. So I was wondering if you encountered like any academics from the Paraguayan side that are also working on that kind of, because I personally haven't, and I am from Paraguay. So I was just wondering, because I would love to hear from that side too.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you for that. And I think when I think about this kind of binational spaces, right, the Guarani territories cross these borders, right? So this kind of idea of indigenous kind of territories and sovereignty not being contained by the national sovereign, and so what it means to think with and beyond the nation state. I think in some ways you're thinking below the nation state, beyond the nation state, sub-nation, all these different levels of scale. Your question, I couldn't answer it specifically in terms of Paraguay, and I will pursue that. But what it makes me think a lot about the kind of coordinations of capital and extractive capital that happen in terms of hydroelectric damming and those technologies, and we can map those right around the world, and how Itapu is like Three Gorges, is like the mega dams that are being built right now in Colombia and all across the Americas in the world, really, right? But then what we forget to do is kind of map the forms of resistance, to go back to the earlier question, the social movements that learn from each other. So just to give a concrete example, in this case, in a case actually in hydroelectric damming in Brazil, in Colombia, a lot was learned from Mapuche indigenous peoples in Chile, and the successful damming, anti-damming projects and uprising they had, mediated by International Rivers. Just to give a shout out to that amazing organization that we're developing a really flushed out partnership with. And there's this way in which everything that Mapuche peoples did, they passed on to indigenous peoples in these other territories as successful strategies. So I guess what I'm pointing to, it's not just capital that coordinates itself, right? And what it means to coordinate amongst us and amongst these kind of actors, social movement actors, and then not always assume, right, that NGOs are just kind of long arms of the state, I think is a popular view in the academy right now. But to actually think of this third space of possibility, which are these kind of international or local NGOs that are doing things that are on the ground, but also really in close contact with the realities that people are facing. So anyway, thank you.
Any more questions?
One back here.
Hi. It is one. Thanks to the entire panel. This is amazing. I have a question for Dr. Dunnavant. I'm wondering about if you could speak some more about the stakes of historical materiality of Black life and of restoring a certain kind of historical and ecological subjectivity to Black folks in the Americas, and kind of like what possibilities that opens up for us. But also, if, as an archaeologist, if this work is in conversation or potentially in conversation with like work around Black indigeneities or even like Black and Indigenous solidarity work?
Definitely, great question. Yes, it is, and I have been reading as much Indigenous studies as I can over the last couple months, just because I'm seeing how much of it is tied together. One of the things in archaeology, Indigenous archaeologists have been developing theory much longer than we have as Black archaeologists and applying it to Indigenous work. And so when they talk about in archaeology, you have people like, I believe it's Sarah Gonzalez at University of Washington, that talks about archaeology for the 7th generation. And what does it look like to do archaeology for our people 7 generations from now? And that completely flips the script on how we even think about how we do archaeology. So the site that they worked at, they actually excavated the artifacts, analyzed them, and then ceremoniously returned them back to the locations where they came from. And that's something that we would never even think to do in archaeology. One of the things I'm going to be exploring actually when I get back home to Nashville is what is an archaeology for the 4th century, to pull from Glissant, and how can we begin to think about an archaeology in the 4th century. So I think that's a very important and key sort of understanding that we need to completely reframe how we even do our practice in order to think about things theoretically. And I think once our practice shifts, the theoretical possibilities and theoretical futures come as a result of that. The other aspect of it that I was thinking of is the theory work related to indigeneity. Sylvia Winter, her book is getting published in Black Metamorphosis, which is an 800-page plus manuscript that was never published. And Brown University is working now to publish that. But what does it mean to be indigenous to a land that we're not necessarily from? And so I think a key part of that and what we can learn from indigenous studies is that while we have our ancestors that we know we have before we came here, these lands have ancestors. And what does it mean to do work in service of the ancestors to this land? And what does it mean to be indigenous to a land that we're not necessarily from, but have a responsibility to? And so I think that as an archaeologist, our goal should be no matter what lands we're touching somebody's sacred land. And we have to respect that and understand that and know that the way that that works is going to be different in different locations and in different places. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah, great question. Thank you.
Coming for you.
Hi, thank you for very interesting presentations. This is maybe kind of for all of you. I was wondering if you could maybe talk more about the relationship between resistance and restoration, because clearly you need resistance, especially like to extractivisms, and this is very important. But is there kind of a point where the thinking could or should be switched more to the restoration part of that equation?
I can take it a little bit. I mean, I've learned this quite a bit right now, not in some of the places I studied in, well, continuing study from the field work and ongoing engagement from the extractive zone, but it in being in subsequent work in Chile right now during the uprising. And I was there in November, December, and really learning a lot from the movement and from young people about what they're doing in relationship to this kind of undoing capitalism, right? Undoing the place from which neoliberalism was born, seeing neoliberalism die is part of that kind of project, right? But at the same time, and resisting the kind of authoritarianism that we're seeing around the world right now, but very locally there in Santiago. Abolitionist practice, right, which has a long arc and learning actually from Black Lives Matter and bringing that in the hemisphere and really connecting those pieces. And so the Metro Fair, discussion is really enlivened both in Brooklyn and Chile and what happens there. But also kind of restoring in terms of restoring each other and thinking what it means to work on what they call la primera línea, or the front line, which is the first line that faces off with the militarized police. In a lot of nations now we're seeing this really intense militarization of the police and so what it means to create spaces of autonomy for each other as part of a restorative practice, of kind of collective autonomy and giving enough to each other to sustain communal autonomous movements. And just watching that in motion in the face of this intense militarized pressure has really given me a lot to think about, that I think the two have to go together, you know, and you kind of the undo and remaking, the creative destructive creative capacities, and really think about it in those ways. I mean, that's what I'm learning a lot right now from the kind of Chilean social movements led by young people, led by feminists, led by indigenous people, immigrants, etc., Afro-Chilenos in Chile now.
Yeah, and I would just to add to that, I think part of this conversation about restore over resist has really come about by watching myself and my colleagues go through major issues of resistance, whether it's, you know, seeing the Trayvon Martin case unfold while we're living in Florida, and watching all of these things play out, and watching how people burn out after a year or 2 years resisting. And when you flip the lens then and say, well, we don't necessarily going to resist, but we're going to find ways to restore, all the restorative work I've seen is healing. I have never seen somebody say, oh man, I'm so tired of restoring this. This is just too much. I need a break. It's a lot of work, and it can be tiring, but it's not as emotionally draining. It's emotionally fulfilling for many people. And I think if we flip the lens on it and begin to move in that way, a collective restorative work is important. People can resist individually, and it leads to isolation. And I think one of the biggest issues we have as communities today is that we're more and more isolated in ourselves because we have this pessimism towards the society, and it's constantly being centered in our minds because we're constantly thinking of how we have to continue to resist. But you have to restore collectively, because the minute you try to restore anything individually, you immediately have to engage with that idea of I'm no longer alone in this, and who am I doing this for? So that's why I center that. Yeah.
No, you're right. We're all so burned and also broken. That I definitely agree, and I also feel a lot of you know, strength and I don't know, hope. That's a word that it's even hard for me to say, but I agree.
I can help you.
I see a lot of it, you know, in this feminist ethics of care. You know, La Primera Línea is beautiful. Las Tesis just, you know, gave me back so much hope in whatever it is that we're doing. And this idea, you know, that we use a lot also in the as protesters and everything that is going on in Colombia as well, is they took away everything to the point that they took away fear. So it's like, here we are. Whatever happens next is like.
May I have a follow-up question? You know, I teach.
You're the boss. You can do whatever you want.
All right, I'll do. I teach contemporary theory, and you know, in last week, the seminar, we've been talking a lot about agency and how, you know, different contemporary theories conceptualize the social actor. So in this conversation about, you know, resistance versus, if I can say versus, right? I don't want to create a dichotomy there because, you know, it could be an issue there, but, you know, resistance vis-a-vis restoration. And I think, Macarena, you talk about resistance and refusal. So are you talking about, I'm thinking about the subjectivity behind it. Because the social actor, particularly if you follow collective action theory, and you know, this conversation about redistributive justice and the grievances and how social actors feel a particular way, maybe deprivation, you know, there's like a subjectivity that sort of, at least theoretically, leads towards people becoming enraged and deciding to join efforts with other human beings. Is there a different conceptualization of subjectivity that needs to take place for these, I don't want to say contradiction there, but moving from resistance to restoration, or finding, you know, this conversation between resistance and refusal? Are we supposed to come from a different place? Is that implied in your comments?
Yeah, I think certainly. I think the idea is that one of the things that we always center is the idea that it's a collective. And the moment you start to think of yourself as an individual, you've lost. And so that's something that is always front and center, again, in restoration and restorative work. The other thing I think is important to, we don't properly analyze, I think, these sort of, how do I phrase it, not the implications of colonialism and but the intentionality behind it. I had a conversation with a professor earlier today here about blackface, and there was a blackface incident on this campus. There was a blackface incident on most campuses throughout the US. And I said, it's very easy to fix that. All you have to do is every time there's a racial incident on the campus, make sure that the racial group that was targeted gets some sort of gain, benefit, whatever it is. Because racists will very quickly stop doing things if they see that the group they're trying to target is clearly benefiting every time they do something negative. And I think that we need to continue to like hold these ideas in our mind. It's like, okay, somebody has this intention of damaging our society. We need to make sure that every time they damage our society, we're not going to penalize them for damaging it. We're going to make sure that every time they try to damage it, we do work to build it. And so I think that's also like a basis of restorative justice. It's like if you had sexual offenders that are then required to do work for the groups that they're sexualizing, that's going to stop them from, it builds this idea of I guess, counter work or building. And so that's the way I frame it. And again, that we're a collective instead of an individual.
Thank you. I was a little bit sneaky there with my question. Do we have other questions from the audience?
Oh, sorry. I think, Dr. Liberato, if you want to have any closing words, that would be lovely.
Okay. Well, I think the panelists are supposed to have the closing words, right? 1 minute. My closing word would be, I think, in the line of what you said, that obviously we have different roles, and some of us have, scholarly roles, activist roles, and, private roles. I think we do need this constructive conversation about issues in a way that we, for ourselves and others, can more clearly define solutions to the problems that we have, no matter what form they take, political, be it authoritarianism, fighting and resisting authoritarian legacies, or extraction and for losing our sense of history. No matter what the issue is, I think it's important to engage in this kind of more clarity about the future that we want. And to me, that's where hope is. It's like, what future and what present do we want, and how can we clearly convey that and construct that together in a way that seems viable to people, so we don't have so much despair.
I mean, I'll say something very brief. I've learned a lot, from this panel today, and what an incredibly well-curated panel. Thank you for bringing us together. It's just been incredible, short but incredible. And for me, I think I've been thinking increasingly both about, our exhaustion in the university, the way that the university is a colonial space, and it too is an extractive industry, right? And the ways in which our own methodologies really need to contend with this history in powerful ways. So what would it mean to actually think about non-extractive relations rather than just extractive relations? Like, really dig into the refusal of the extractive machine by reorganizing ourselves despite the kind of military hierarchies that exist in the academy, despite all of these highly capitalized forms of exhaustion, of stealing our somatic power to power, right, colonial universities. And I think for me, I don't necessarily know that, and it feels new to kind of turn and begin to think from the space of non-extractive relationalities, that think through Black and Indigenous ontologies, that don't binarize sea and land, that don't binarize disciplines, et cetera, et cetera. And that's part of the work, I think. That's just kind of where I'm at the edge of my thinking. And so I would just share that with you as a kind of final thought, the non-extractive relational possibilities.
The last thing I would say, I guess, is geared more so to the students than anybody. And I think that doing this work oftentimes requires us to go covert for a little bit. That St. Croix project I set that up my last year of my dissertation work while I was finishing my dissertation research in Ethiopia. My advisor initially heard about it and said, don't do that, focus on your dissertation only. And I quickly became quiet and pushed the project through. So in many ways, I'm not saying don't listen to your advisors, that's not what I'm saying. I think it's important that all of you as students understand who you are as scholars and who you want to be. And that doesn't happen overnight. It happens through interactions and engagements with communities, with friends, with allies, with colleagues. And also understand what this institution is and what it means. We are operating in a space where we are very privileged. Our societies have invested in us to do nothing but study problems. That means we have a responsibility to come up with solutions to them. This institution should have been created to study problems related to Kentucky and then the greater society as a whole. And it should address that first and foremost as a state institution. That's its responsibility. Don't let them tell you that there's a client sort of business relationship and that students pay tuition, so students are, no, we all have a goal and a collective to that. And then last thing I'll leave you with, it's an analogy that I always kind of center whenever I see something amazing flourishing. And it's when you see a beautiful flower, you don't praise the flower for its beauty. You praise the society and the ecosystem and the environment that allowed that flower to flourish. So I think more and more of us need to study these environments and these flowers that allow these flowers to flourish. And if we study that and recreate those, we'll have a beautiful garden. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to each panel, and thank you to every one of you for being here.